The day she returned to Hargrave House, the air held its breath. After 30 years, Vivian Hargrave crossed the threshold of her childhood home, only to find the silence heavier than memory, and the past not nearly as buried as she thought. A sealed letter from a man long presumed dead waits in the dust. A sister whispers secrets in her fevered sleep, and the name Thaddeus Clay still lingers like perfume in every room. What do you do when the love you lost was never truly gone? When truth arrives too late, but still demands to be heard? Welcome to the second spring, a story of devotion, regret, and the power of a love that refuses to die. Tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what is it about historical romances that always pulls you in? Savannah, Georgia, year of our Lord, 1872. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and memory as the carriage wheels groaned their final turn on the moss-lined drive. Shadows of ancient oaks bent low, their gnarled branches veiled in Spanish moss, as though bowing to receive the woman who had once walked this path with light in her eyes, and who now returned cloaked in widow's black, her heart a cathedral of silence. Vivian Hargrave stepped down without assistance. At 58, she moved not with the frailty of age, but with the solemn grace of a woman who had carried grief so long it had reshaped her into something finer, quieter. Her dark gown, bombazine, with its matte sheen and heavy drape, fell in precise pleats to the cobbled earth. A faded grey spencer hugged her slender frame, and beneath her bonnet the silver strands woven into her chignon caught the fading light like threads of sorrow. Her gloved hands trembled only slightly as she gripped the iron gate. Hargrave House awaited her in mournful dignity. Once a proud testament to southern refinement, now it stood like a weary matron, shutters bowed, ivy crawling hungrily along its brick facade. The windows, clouded with dust, reflected nothing but the creeping dusk. It was no longer the house of her girlhood dreams or of family laughter. It had become a mausoleum of forgotten music and unsent words. Inside, the silence was nearly sacred. The hallway welcomed her with the scent of beeswax, old books, and illness. Etta had written to her weeks ago, scrawled handwriting, ink blotched with fever and desperation. "Come home," the letter had pleaded, "or it will be too late to say anything worth saying." Vivian had come not from love alone, but from the haunting sense that if she did not return now, she never would. The drawing room was as she remembered, and yet it was smaller, dimmer. The furniture slumbered beneath white sheets, ghostly in the fading light. Dust motes floated like forgotten memories in the air. She lit the oil lamp with practiced fingers, casting a golden hush across the floral wallpaper and framed miniatures. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the room, each creak of the floorboards a whispered memory. She paused at the fireplace, black with soot, framed by marble veined like mourning lace, and set down her valise. With care, she unfastened her bonnet and gloves, placing them on the mantel with the reverence of a woman undressing her former self. Then, with sleeves pushed to her elbows, she began to remove the coverings from the furniture, shaking loose not only the dust, but years of neglect. It was behind the escritoire that she found it. A flutter, barely a sound. Something dislodged as she shifted a stack of yellowed sheet music. There, tucked beneath the leg of the cabinet as though hidden in a moment of breathless urgency, lay an envelope, aged, sealed. The ink faded, but unmistakably his. Vivian's breath caught. Her fingers hovered above it, heart pounding with a rhythm she had not felt in decades. She lifted the envelope slowly, as if fearing it might dissolve beneath her touch. The wax seal bore the faint impression of the clay crest. Thaddeus. She did not sit. She could not. She broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolded the fragile paper, and began to read beneath the flicker of the lamp. The words were gentle, desperate, alive. He was alive. In the spring of 1864, he had survived. A wound to the chest, but breath in his lungs. He had written from a military hospital near Raleigh, pleading for her to wait, to hold on, to believe in what they once were. He would come for her, he promised. He would return. But he had never returned. Vivian's eyes blurred. She clutched the letter to her chest, lips parted in silence. For a long moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. All these years, she had mourned him as lost to battle, as another name carved in stone, taken by cannon smoke and cruel fate. But now the truth rose like ash from old fire. Someone had kept this letter from her. Someone had silenced him. She folded the letter with reverence, as if folding a body into a casket. Outside, the first cricket sang. Behind her, the ticking clock on the mantel resumed its rhythm. Vivian turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room not as a visitor, but as a woman who had been exiled from her own past. She would stay. For Etta. For herself. For the man who had once whispered her name like a vow, and who had, in ink and blood, asked her to wait. In that moment, Vivian Hargrave did not weep. But the silence that surrounded her, ancient, bitter and trembling, did. The morning light in Savannah had the softness of old parchment, filtered through veils of mist that curled along the iron railings and stone paths like secrets too heavy to rise. The city breathed slowly beneath the weight of spring's damp promise, and Hargrave House stirred under a canopy of stillness. Yet within its worn walls, Vivian Hargrave was already dressed, her morning gown immaculate, her bonnet tied with unyielding precision, her gloves smoothing the folds of memory that threatened to crease her resolve. She did not tell Etta where she was going. Some doors, she knew, had to be opened in solitude. The carriage waited on the outer lane, driven by a boy no older than 16 with a hollow stare and borrowed boots. Vivian offered no conversation. Her eyes remained fixed on the road as they passed familiar streets, now faded echoes of a city that once danced with ballrooms and bonnets. Trees, once tended by careful hands, now leaned wearily into the road, their branches like outstretched arms, trying to remember something they had lost. She felt it before she saw it. The clay estate stood at the edge of the city like a monument to stubbornness. What had once been a mansion of marble steps and silver eaves was now sunken under layers of ivy, its shutters dark, its iron gates sealed more by pride than rust. The house loomed, not grand but accusing, a relic that refused to surrender even as it crumbled. Vivian stepped down from the carriage with a grace too practiced to falter. Her boots touched the gravel drive, and the stones gave a soft crackle like dry leaves breaking underfoot in a family crypt. She approached the door slowly, her gloved hand curled around the letter, now tucked into the inner lining of her bodice. Its paper warm against her skin, its words burning where her heart no longer dared to speak. She knocked. The sound echoed through the hollow chambers behind the heavy door. Moments passed, then footsteps, slow, sharp, precise. The door opened with a metallic sigh, and there she was, Adeline Clay, 60 years old, though time dared not touch her posture. Her gown was a deep forest green moiré, buttoned to the throat, trimmed in black velvet. Her silver hair was wound tightly into a severe coil at the crown of her head, not a strand out of place. Her expression was as unreadable as the sea in winter, and her eyes, pale as glass, narrowed with a silent question. "Vivian Hargrave," she said without warmth, without invitation. "I came to speak with you," Vivian answered, her voice even, her chin high. "About your brother." A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed Adeline's features. "Thaddeus has been dead for 8 years. Then you have nothing to fear from what I carry." Adeline stepped aside without a word, allowing Vivian into the dim vestibule. The air inside was heavy with lavender oil and thyme. No music played, no fire warmed the hearth. The walls were lined with portraits, clay men in uniforms, clay women in lace, and in the center of them all, the unmistakable gaze of Thaddeus, forever 35, forever unreachable. They sat opposite each other in the drawing room, a fireless place with high ceilings and furniture that had once been imported from Paris, now cloaked in a fine coat of sorrow. Vivian reached into her bodice and laid the letter on the table between them. "I found it 2 days ago," she said, eyes fixed on Adeline's face. "It was hidden behind a cabinet in my father's study, dated the spring of 1864. He survived, Adeline. He wrote to me." Adeline did not touch the letter. Her gloved fingers remained folded like marble at her waist. "And yet he did not return to you," she said, each word drawn slowly, like a blade. "So, the letter changes nothing." Vivian leaned forward, her voice low, steady, more dangerous than rage. "It changes everything." The silence that followed was brittle. Adeline rose first. "You romanticize the past, Vivian. You always did. That boy was not the man you believed. War makes liars of men and fools of women." Vivian stood as well, taller by an inch and far more resolute. "And what does fear make of sisters?" That line cracked something behind Adeline's gaze, though she would never show it. "Let the past die, Vivian," she whispered coldly. "You dig in graves hoping to find warmth, but all that remains is rot." Vivian gathered her gloves, her eyes never leaving the older woman's. "No, Adeline. Some things don't rot. Some things burn quietly beneath the ash, waiting for breath." She left without waiting for a response. Outside, the air had thickened. Clouds rolled low across the sky, carrying with them the scent of magnolia blossoms opening in defiance of the approaching rain. Vivian stepped into the carriage, her hands still trembling, not with weakness but with fury barely contained. She pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes. Thaddeus had not been a ghost. He had not been a dream. He had reached for her, and something, had made certain his hand never met hers. That night, as dusk folded over Savannah like a silk shroud, Vivian sat at her writing desk, the oil lamp casting golden light across the parlor. Her fingertips brushed the worn edges of the letter once more before she placed it gently into a drawer she locked with a key she hadn't used in years. She turned toward the stairs, moving quietly, and stopped at the threshold of Etta's room. Her sister slept restlessly, tangled in linen and old fever dreams. Her lips moved faintly in the dark. Vivian stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. "I should have burned them," Etta murmured, voice ragged and distant. "But I didn't." The words struck like a thunderclap in a silent room. Vivian froze, her heart beat so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. She leaned closer, but Etta turned, groaning softly, and fell back into stillness. Vivian stood there for several minutes, unmoving. She said nothing, she asked nothing, but inside her something had shifted, subtle, undeniable. A weight had loosened from the chain of silence. There were letters, more than one. There were choices made. And there was guilt, deep, embedded, still festering after years. Vivian did not sleep that night. She remained by the window, watching the slow bloom of the magnolia under the stars. The tree he had once kissed her beneath. The tree that had shed its flowers year after year, as if mourning something lost in its roots. She could still see him, not clearly, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. He stood in her mind's eye wearing his frock coat, his boots dust-covered from long roads, his hand scarred from war reaching out, his voice hoarse, soft, true. She did not reach back, not yet, but the ache in her chest no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something awakening, something that had been waiting patiently beneath the ashes. The rain began at dawn, slow and uncertain, as if the sky itself were unsure whether to cleanse or mourn. Hargrave House held its breath beneath the grey veil of morning, and within its time-worn walls, Vivian Hargrave moved like a spectre between rooms, her steps soundless, her thoughts too loud. The parlour smelled of damp wood and rosewater, and the windows wept with condensation, as if echoing her unrest. Vivian's hands, though gloved, felt the trembling of something unspoken in the air. She had not returned to her writing desk. Not yet. The drawer that held Thaddeus's letter remained locked, the key tucked beneath her pillow. Her heart, however, remained open, aching, trembling, searching. She needed truth, not memories, not dreams, not rumors whispered by women in lace-trimmed parlors with porcelain smiles. She needed what had been hidden, and sometimes truth was stubborn. It did not sit on desks. It buried itself in silence and dust. She found the second letter while attempting to restore the old music cabinet in the study. Her late father had once kept it near the hearth, where warm evenings were filled with the echo of sonatas and Etta's uneven scales on the pianoforte. Now it stood like a forgotten mourner in a corner, its varnish dulled, its keys silent. She moved it carefully, intending only to polish the wood, and heard the sharp snap of warped floorboards beneath. It was instinct, not intention, that made her kneel. The floor gave beneath her touch an uneven slat, subtly lifted near the seam. Her breath caught as she pried it loose, fingers careful, reverent. There, nestled in a hollowed groove dark with time, lay a folded envelope. The ink had faded into a ghostly script, but she knew the hand, knew it in her bones. The sight of it brought heat to her chest and cold to her fingers. She opened it slowly. The words inside trembled with pain. He wrote from a field hospital, uncertain of where he was or what had happened. He spoke of hunger, fever, and confusion. But most of all, he wrote of silence. Your silence, dearest Vivian, is more cruel than any wound. I ask myself if you have forgotten, or if someone has made you forget. The ink was smudged in places. She imagined it was from his fingers, weak, unwashed, trembling. He had signed it not with flourish, but with ache. If I never hear from you again, know this. I lived for the memory of you, and I will die with it too. Vivian sat there on the floor, letter in her lap, hands in her lap, heart breaking in unbearable quiet. She could no longer believe that the letters had been lost by mere accident. They had been hidden. Someone had hidden them deliberately. She rose slowly, the floor creaking under her weight. There was someone in Savannah who might help. Someone whose name had surfaced once or twice in Etta's conversations with the vicar. A man of quiet dignity and deep knowledge. A widower, like herself. A man who had survived the war, not on the battlefield, but through books and memory. Jonah Bennett, the local historian, and more importantly, a man who had never been part of the circles that had dismissed her. She found him 2 days later beneath the vaulted arches of the Savannah Historical Society. The building sat near the old square, its entrance shaded by a centuries-old oak. The scent of old paper and wax filled the air the moment she crossed the threshold. Jonah stood at a long table strewn with maps and bound ledgers, his spectacles perched low on his nose, his salt and pepper beard trimmed with the careful neatness of a man who understood that dignity resided in small details. He wore a brown wool coat patched at the elbow and a vest faded with use, but everything about him radiated steadiness. He looked up when she entered, his expression one of gentle curiosity. "Mrs. Hargrave," he said, inclining his head, "you honor our archives." Vivian hesitated only a moment, then spoke with quiet urgency. "I believe I'm in need of more than archives, Mr. Bennett. I'm in need of the truth." He listened as she explained, not everything but enough. The letters, the dates, the silence that followed. His eyes never left hers, though he did not interrupt. When she placed the second letter gently upon the table, he regarded it with a tenderness that startled her. "I have seen too many stories lost in fire," he said after a long silence. "Too many truths scattered by hands too proud to keep them." She lowered her eyes, suddenly shy. "I do not wish to chase ghosts, only clarity." "Sometimes," he murmured. "Ghosts are only truths with no one brave enough to speak them." He took the letter into gloved hands, adjusting his spectacles. His fingers were ink-stained, and she wondered what he had written, and for whom. As he studied the seal and script, a hush fell between them, not of discomfort, but of something unspoken beginning to stir. "I can trace this," he said at last. "Dates, locations, military records, letters like this. They often pass through hands before being buried, figuratively or otherwise. Vivian nodded, but her voice caught in her throat. And if it leads to nothing, then at least you will know you followed the thread, he replied, and that it was your hands that held it. There was something about the way he looked at her, without pity, without assumption, that softened something inside her. She had grown so accustomed to glances that pitied her widowhood, that dismissed her as a woman past feeling. But Jonah Bennett looked at her not as someone broken, but as someone unfinished. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms dusted with silver hair and veins like inked lines beneath parchment skin. Then with gentle precision, he opened a register, found the year of the letter and began to write. Vivian sat beside him. They did not speak often, but the pages rustled like wind through trees, and the lamplight caught the curve of his brow as he read aloud names, units, locations. Occasionally, his fingers brushed hers as they turned the brittle corners of history together. Each contact was fleeting, but weighty. By the time the sky outside had darkened, they had uncovered the route of Thaddeus's regiment, a list of medical outposts near Raleigh, and a dispatch report listing a T. Clay marked as injured, not deceased. Vivian's breath hitched. Jonah did not speak, but he offered her a handkerchief, not out of gallantry, but out of understanding. As she dabbed her eyes, she asked softly, "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Bennett?" He paused, then smiled faintly. "I believe in threads. In some hands, knowing how to find them, and in others, knowing when to let go." Vivian stared at the page between them, at the lines and lines of names that had once been men. Men who had written letters, begged for return, vanished into fields soaked with blood. "Do you think he blamed me?" she whispered. Jonah looked at her fully then, his voice rich and unwavering. No man who wrote like that ever blamed the woman he loved. Silence fell again, but this time it was charged with something deeper, as if the very air between them had shifted. Vivian stood, smoothing her skirts with slow precision. She had not intended to spend the whole day, and yet she could not recall the last time she had spoken so long or been seen so clearly. "Thank you," she said. He stood as well, not too close, not too far. "You know where to find me," he said gently. "When the next letter appears." She blinked. "You think there's another?" "I think secrets are rarely buried alone." As she stepped back out into the rain-washed evening, the city felt different, closer, more intimate, as though something had shifted beneath the stones. Vivian drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked once over her shoulder. Jonah still stood at the window watching her leave. He did not wave, but he did not turn away. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Hargrave House, weaving golden threads across the parlor floor, but its warmth did not reach Vivian. She stood before the mirror, fastening the delicate jet brooch at the base of her high collar. The reflection that stared back at her was composed, dignified, every strand of hair pinned with precision. But beneath the somber layers of her bombazine gown, beneath the posture shaped by years of duty, a fire had begun to stir. Not a violent blaze, but the kind that smoldered in silence, patient, unyielding, waiting. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wisteria and whispers. Vivian knew Savannah's society well. She had once belonged to its afternoon teas, its Sunday strolls, its gloved smiles and veiled cruelties, and now she knew its silence too, a silence made not of kindness, but of knives dulled by repetition. She had seen the glances. They came like echoes in church pews, in the post office, in the milliner's shop, slight turns of the head, hushed voices behind lace fans. "Poor Mrs. Hargrave, still haunted," they murmured, "still wearing black for a man who never returned. Still asking questions best left buried." But it was not the town that had planted those whispers. It was a woman, one woman, Adeline Clay, regal, untouched, unrepentant. Vivian had felt her presence ripple through the drawing rooms, even when she was absent. The tone of her voice carried in others' mouths, reshaping truth into something palatable for the weak. She did not accuse Vivian directly. She did not need to. Her disdain walked ahead of her like a footman. It was on a Thursday afternoon that Vivian decided to face the world again, if only to prove that she still could. The Ladies' Committee for Hospital Restoration was hosting a gathering at the Greystone Hall veranda, and Etta, who had taken a turn for the better that week, encouraged her gently to attend. "You've always been stronger than them," Etta said, her fingers thin and trembling against Vivian's hand. "Don't let them dress you in silence." Vivian kissed her sister's brow, then turned toward the closet. She chose a slate-grey walking dress with a silk underskirt, modest yet elegant, with black ribbon trim and matching gloves. Her bonnet was adorned only with a small jet rosette, enough to be appropriate, but not enough to be forgotten. If they would look at her, she would give them something worth seeing. The event was already underway when she arrived. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the whisper of parasols, and conversation buzzed with the faint bitterness of lemonade and restrained boredom. Vivian stepped onto the veranda with slow, deliberate grace. Heads turned. A few nods greeted her. None approached. She stood alone beneath a striped canopy, her gloved hands folded lightly, her gaze calm, watching the other women float from group to group as if nothing had changed, as if war had not broken homes and hearts alike. It was Mrs. Holden who approached her first, hesitant voice pitched too sweetly. "My dear Mrs. Hargrave," she said, her lace sleeve fluttering like nervous wings, "we were just saying how terribly hard it must be to revisit all those memories. The Clay family, the war, your letters. It's very noble of you, truly. But one mustn't live in the past, must one?" Vivian offered her a smile that did not reach her eyes. "And yet here we are," she replied, "gathered to restore a building built in the past, funded by the wealth of men who died in the war you now choose to forget." Mrs. Alden blinked, color rising in her powdered cheeks. I meant only that people talk." Vivian tilted her head. "Let them." She turned away, her steps as steady as her breath, though something twisted inside her. She did not expect applause. She only wished for silence to be hers to command, not imposed upon her like a punishment. She was about to leave when she saw him, Jonah Bennett. He stood under the shade of a magnolia, a cane at his side, a worn leather portfolio under his arm. His coat was pressed, his collar a little high, but his presence was quiet strength incarnate. His eyes found her instantly, not with urgency but recognition, and something warmer, something steadying. He crossed the lawn toward her with his characteristic limp, barely noticeable except in the way it made each step deliberate. As he approached, the gathering quieted, not with reverence but with interest, the widow and the historian, the ghost chaser and the ghost keeper. "Mrs. Hargrave," he said gently, bowing his head. "Mr. Bennett, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Nor I you," he gave a half smile. "We historians find it difficult to ignore crumbling foundations, especially when they're being covered in silk and citrus." She allowed a small laugh to escape, brief but real. "Have you made any discoveries?" "I have," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. Thaddeus Clay's name appears on a list of field transfers dated October of 1864. He was moved further south, possibly to a facility near Macon, but the records are damaged, some torn. It's as though someone wanted that particular trail to go cold. Vivian felt her throat tighten. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Then he didn't die in Raleigh." "No," Jonah said, watching her closely. "Not there." A silence stretched between them, alive with grief, with questions, with something tender hovering just beneath the surface. And then, behind her, a familiar voice coiled through the air. "How curious to see you here, Mr. Bennett. I wasn't aware that funeral records required such fashionable attendance." Adeline. She stood not 3 paces away, her gown a deep shade of plum, her gloves pristine, her posture carved from stone. Her eyes were fixed on Jonah, not Vivian. The performance had begun. He turned to her slowly, inclining his head with polite formality. Miss Clay, I was under the impression this event welcomed those interested in healing. Adeline smiled thinly. Some wounds are better left to scar, Mr. Bennet. Reopening them only invites infection. Vivian felt the heat rise in her chest, but Jonah's voice cut through, cool and unyielding. And yet, infection thrives in darkness, Miss Clay, in silence, and in the fear of truth. Adeline's smile faded, her eyes narrowed, and for the first time Vivian saw something slip in her poise. A crack, a flicker of rage, too old to name. Jonah turned to Vivian. If you'll allow me, Mrs. Hargrave, I'd be honored to escort you back. Vivian nodded, her voice momentarily stolen. He offered his arm, not forcefully, but with simple dignity. She took it. The cane in his right hand tapped softly against the stone path as they walked away, leaving Adeline standing alone in the light she had once commanded. They said nothing until they reached the edge of the garden. "Why did you do that?" Vivian finally asked. He looked at her, eyes warm, voice low. "Because I know what it means to lose a voice, and I will not let them take yours." She swallowed hard, her grip on his arm tightening for just a second. "I wasn't always like this," she whispered. "Neither was I," he said. "I returned from war to a house that no longer knew my name. My wife, she died while I was gone. A fever, a week before my letter reached her." Vivian turned to him, stunned. "I didn't know." "Most don't," he replied. "Some things we carry quietly, but that does not mean they do not weigh us down." They stood at the gate, the world hushed around them. When she finally released his arm, their hands touched, barely a breath of skin against skin, but it was enough. Enough to say that something fragile had begun. Not yet love, not yet hope, but the whisper of both. Vivian returned home that evening with her chin high and her heart unsettled. Behind her, Savannah carried on in lace and murmur. But within her, a battle had begun, not against memory, but against forgetting. And the mask of decency that had suffocated her for so long had finally begun to crack. The morning was thick with humidity, as if the air itself were reluctant to rise from its slumber. A silver mist clung to the earth, blurring the outline of the garden beyond the parlor window. Hargrave House seemed to breathe slowly, the old wood stretching beneath the silence of another summer day. Vivian stood by the window, fingers resting lightly on the pane, watching as a single magnolia petal drifted to the damp grass. Its fall, slow and soundless, felt like an echo of something long buried. In her hand, she held a small cup of tea, untouched and cooling, the china rim trembling slightly between her fingers. The weight in her chest was not new, but today it felt heavier, more insistent. It was the kind of weight that demanded to be named, or else risk becoming part of her forever. Behind her, from the direction of the staircase, came the soft, uneven rhythm of footsteps. Etta, each step labored, punctuated by a wheezing breath and the rustle of her wool shawl. Vivian turned before her sister reached the bottom, setting the teacup aside as she crossed the parlor to meet her. "Sit," Vivian said gently, guiding her to the worn armchair by the hearth. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Etta, 51 and worn thinner with each passing day, offered a tight smile. "The body resists," she rasped, "but the guilt insists." Vivian arched an eyebrow. "That's a curious thing to say." Etta did not respond immediately. Her eyes, once so like Vivian's, drifted toward the fireless grate, as though studying some memory that refused to fade. Her hands, frail and trembling, clutched the edges of her shawl. Vivian returned to the window. "Do you remember the night he came to me before the war?" she asked softly. "He was dressed in grey. His boots were caked in dust. He didn't even sit. He just stood there in the middle of the parlor and said, 'Wait for me, Vivian, no matter what they say.'" Etta's breath caught. "I waited," Vivian continued, her voice flat, almost fragile. "I wore black when he didn't return. Not for Charles Hargrave, not for the man I married out of duty and nothing more, but for Thaddeus Clay." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. Etta's hands tightened over her knees. "You never spoke of that marriage." "Because there was nothing to say." Vivian crossed the room slowly. "My husband was chosen for me after your illness and father's stroke. The alliance served practical ends. It lasted 2 years. He died of consumption in New Orleans. I was never his wife in spirit, only in name. And yet you kept his name," Etta whispered. "I kept it because it offered me cover. Widowhood is a more tolerable sorrow than longing. People show you kindness when they believe you followed the rules." She paused, eyes fixed on her sister. "But I never took off my mourning for Thaddeus, never once." Etta's lips trembled, and a flush rose to her sallow cheeks. "Vivian!" Vivian knelt before her, grasping her hands. "Tell me what you've held back." There was silence for a moment so deep that the ticking of the mantel clock sounded like thunder. Etta closed her eyes. "Adeline came to the house in the autumn of '64. You were at the church fair, I believe. She arrived unannounced, dressed in black, her gloves still damp from the rain. She looked furious, controlled, like someone who had already decided what justice looked like." Vivian felt her pulse quicken. "She handed me a bundle of letters," Etta continued. "She said they were from Thaddeus, intercepted before they reached you. She demanded I destroy them, said they would ruin your future, that he was no longer the man you remembered, that he had turned his back on the South, on honor, on you." Vivian's breath caught. "I couldn't do it," Etta whispered. "I couldn't bring myself to burn them. So I hid them, behind the floorboard, behind the cabinet. I thought it would be temporary, that I'd return them when the war ended, when it was safe. But you never did." "No," Etta's voice broke. "I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore, that you were married, that there was nothing to be gained by reopening old wounds. But the truth is, I was ashamed of my cowardice, ashamed of what I had cost you." Tears welled in Vivian's eyes, but they did not fall. Her body was too still, too focused, her heart racing with something between fury and heartbreak. She stood slowly, walking toward the window again, needing distance from the weight of the confession. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me now?" "Because I found something," Etta said, her voice smaller now. "Something I kept separate. One letter. I couldn't destroy it, couldn't hide it with the others. I told myself it was because it frightened me. But the truth is, it was the only one that felt like it was meant to be read." Vivian turned. Etta reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, but still sealed. She held it out, her hand trembling. Vivian took it, staring at the familiar handwriting, at the name written in ink that had long since faded. Vivian Hargrave. There was no date, no address, only the weight of a man's soul enclosed within it. She did not open it. Not yet. Her fingers curled around it and she closed her eyes. Her throat was dry, her heart loud in her ears. "I can never undo what I did," Etta said behind her. "But I swear to you, Vivian, I never stopped hoping you would find him again, even when I lost the strength to believe it myself." Vivian turned back to her sister, her voice low and broken. "You robbed me of years, of answers, of choices that were mine to make. I know." Vivian looked at her long and hard, her breath caught halfway between reproach and release. Then, slowly, she knelt once more and took Etta's hands again, this time without fury. "You should have trusted me," she whispered. "But I forgive you, because I will not let this grief define either of us." Etta wept, softly, silently, the kind of tears that do not scream, but cleanse. Vivian rose, letter in hand, and walked to the window once more. The sky had cleared. Light poured in, soft and golden, illuminating the dust in the air like a constellation of forgotten moments. She did not open the letter that morning. She would not open it while her hands still trembled. She would wait until she was ready, until her soul had steadied. For now she pressed the envelope gently to her chest and closed her eyes. And in the stillness of that moment, she was not the woman scorned by society, nor the widow pitied by acquaintances. She was the woman who had waited, And who would keep waiting until every secret gave up its name? The late afternoon sun cast a golden veil across the earth, its warmth deceptive against the quiet ache that pressed into Vivian's chest. The carriage rolled slowly through the oak-lined road that led to the Clay family cemetery, its wheels crunching over gravel like whispers of regret. The air was still, stifling, perfumed with the heavy scent of blooming azaleas and the faint rot of fallen magnolia blossoms. Vivian sat rigid, gloved hands folded tightly over her lap, the letter from Thaddeus tucked safely inside the small reticule at her side. She had not yet opened it. It had remained sealed for days, like a sleeping truth she feared to wake. But today was not about words. Today was about stone, about what had been carved into it, and what had not. The cemetery appeared just beyond the bend, surrounded by a low wrought-iron fence, its posts tipped with rust. The clay mausoleum stood at its center, pale and austere, framed by willows that bowed with the weight of years. Family plots flanked both sides, orderly in arrangement but not in sentiment. Time had laid itself unevenly across the place. Some headstones gleamed new and well-tended, while others leaned with erosion and sorrow, half sunk into the soil as though the dead beneath them were pulling them close. The driver pulled to a stop. Vivian stepped out slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. The sound of birds was distant. Even the wind seemed to hush as she passed through the open gate and into the heart of the past. She moved with purpose, though each step grew heavier. Her eyes scanned names etched into marble, uncles, cousins, a mother long forgotten by society, but remembered here in stone. And then she saw it. Thaddeus Clay, born April 12th, 1829. Died December 3rd, 1864. Beloved son, loyal Confederate, a simple headstone, smooth, upright, framed by two slender yews whose roots had begun to tangle at the base. But there was no grave, no earth disturbed, no stone slab above soil, only the marker planted in solid ground like a monument to the unseen. Vivian stared at it, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. Her knees weakened. She reached for the stone, brushing her gloved fingers over the name as though expecting to feel warmth in the marble. The date, the lie. He had not died in December. He had written to her after, walked, breathed, hoped, and someone, Adeline, society, fate, had sealed him away before his time. There was no body beneath this earth, no coffin, only silence made solid. Vivian dropped to her knees before the headstone, her skirts fanning around her like a wound. Her breath came unevenly, her heart hammering as if to escape the truth pressing into her from all sides. "I waited for you," she whispered. "All these years. I waited, and they made you believe I had forgotten you." The wind picked up, rustling the trees gently as if carrying her words away. To where, she did not know. She closed her eyes, and in the dimness behind her lids, she saw him again, not in the uniform of war, but in the linen coat he wore the last night they danced beneath the magnolias. His eyes, grey, unwavering, his mouth parted with words he never got to say. She reached for him, but he vanished as always, just before her fingers met his. Footsteps behind her stirred her from the vision. Steady, familiar. She turned slowly. Jonah Bennett stood a few paces away, hat in hand, coat dusted from travel. He had not come with her. She had not asked. And yet here he was, presence quiet but grounding, as if the earth steadied itself when he approached. "I wasn't sure I should come," he said softly. "I'm glad you did." He looked at the stone, then at her. "There's no record of a burial," he said, "only the headstone. It was commissioned by Judge Clay, shortly after the war ended." Vivian rose slowly, brushing her skirts free of grass and memory. Why mark a death that hadn't happened? Jonah hesitated. Then he reached into the satchel slung over his shoulder and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Because they thought they'd lost control of the story. She took it from him, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a statement dated March of 1866, signed by a Union soldier turned merchant, a man named Simon Trask, a name Jonah had traced through weeks of letters and municipal records. He had met Thaddeus Clay, alive. Then, wounded but lucid, the man had returned to Savannah looking for a woman named Vivian Hargrave. He had inquired at Hargrave House, at the church, at the station. He was told by a woman he described as tall, pale, severe, that Vivian had married another. He left that night. Simon never saw him again. Vivian's hands trembled as she read. The words blurred and reformed beneath her tears. Jonah did not speak. He stood with his head bowed, hands clasped gently behind his back. "He believed I had forgotten him," she whispered. Jonah's voice was rough with emotion. "He came back. That says everything." Vivian turned away from the stone, clutching the document to her chest. "But he died thinking I didn't wait." Jonah stepped forward, his cane pressing into the soft soil. He stood beside her now, closer than propriety might allow, but not closer than grief required. "He died believing you were safe, that you had moved on, that your heart had survived him. The day is not nothing." Vivian turned to him then, her eyes searching his face, marked by time, sorrow, wisdom. He did not flinch beneath her gaze. He bore it like a man who had spent years holding other people's losses, until they became part of his own. "He was the great love of my youth," she said softly. "I know, but I do not wish to carry this sorrow alone." Jonah's voice was almost a whisper. "Then don't." They stood in silence, two figures beneath the watchful branches of the yew trees, while the sun cast long shadows across names carved in stone. The past did not lift, it did not ease, but in that moment it folded around them, like a memory that no longer burned but warmed. Vivian looked once more at the headstone. There was no body, no remains, only the knowledge that he had lived for her, loved her beyond absence, and returned, only to be turned away by the lie that she had forgotten. Her tears came then, not as sobs but as slow, steady rivers down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. And when Jonah reached for her hand, she let him take it, not as a replacement, not as a balm, but as a witness, a keeper of what was lost and what remained. For Thaddeus, for herself, for the woman who had waited, and the man who had come too late to be loved, but not too late to be remembered. The sky over Savannah darkened with the hush of a coming storm, the clouds swollen with promises too long unspoken. The wind swept gently through the trees, gathering the scents of damp earth and distant magnolia, carrying them across the veranda of Hargrave House, where Vivian stood, motionless. Her gaze was fixed on the narrow path leading to the gate, where a figure in a weather-beaten coat had just dismounted from a mule-drawn cart. He was a stranger by appearance, dust clinging to his boots, his hat shadowing sun-aged features. But something in the way he held the satchel at his side spoke not of commerce or chance, but of reverence. He moved slowly, as if the very weight of what he carried demanded silence. Vivian descended the steps before the housekeeper could summon her. She crossed the lawn with quiet purpose, her black skirts brushing against the dew-drenched grass, her gloves damp with the touch of morning's hour. "You're Mrs. Hargrave?" the man asked, his voice low and hesitant, as though saying her name aloud required permission. "I am," she replied softly. He removed his hat, eyes cast downward. "My name is Ezra Poe. I work the freight lines through Galveston, and sometimes farther west. 2 weeks ago, near a small settlement by the Rio Frio, I was called to help clear a collapsed shack. Under the floorboards I found these." He lifted the satchel. They were kept in a wooden box, sealed. Protected from time and rodents, there was a name scratched into the wood. Vivian said nothing. Her heart thudded against her ribs like a bell struck in a silent chapel. "Thaddeus Clay," he finished. Inside was a journal, a letter, and a flower. Ezra extended the satchel slowly. Vivian reached for it with trembling hands. She nodded in thanks, though the words refused to form. The man tipped his hat again, then turned to leave, his figure swallowed by the heavy quiet of the afternoon. She did not open the satchel outside. She carried it carefully into the parlor, where the light was soft and golden, and the air still bore the scent of rose oil from the morning's quiet attempt at cleaning. She placed it on the low table near the window, beside the faded chaise where she had once listened for news, where she had once pressed her cheek against the cold glass, waiting for a letter that never came. Her fingers, though slow, were deliberate as she undid the leather buckles and peeled back the canvas. Inside, nestled among carefully folded linen, lay a small cedar box. Its corners were cracked, but the lid was intact, the carving still visible beneath the dust. Vivian opened it. The journal lay atop the bundle. Its cover was worn, the leather softened by time and touch. She turned the pages gently, each filled with Thaddeus's hand. Elegant, slanted, sometimes unsteady. The ink told stories of travel, of pain, of solitude, but more than anything, it told of her. Her name appeared again and again, in reverie, in longing, in resignation. Then she saw it. Pressed between two pages was a magnolia blossom, dry, fragile, its petals yellowed at the edges but still whole. She reached for it as if touching a relic, as if it would vanish beneath her breath. She brought it to her chest, closed her eyes and wept, not for the first time, but for the first time without restraint. Beneath the flower was a single envelope. Her name. Not written hastily, not blurred by moisture or anger, but carefully. Vivian Hargrave, in the same hand that had once drawn maps for her in the dirt with a stick and traced poems in the fogged windowpane of his boyhood room. She opened it. "If you're reading this," it began, "it means I never made it back to you. And I suppose the silence you gave me was not silence at all, but something stolen by the world that conspired to keep us apart. I want you to know, if nothing else, that I believed in you until my last breath. You were never a dream. You were never a girl I simply remembered. You were my home. You always were. There were days when I imagined you happy, and others when I feared you had forgotten me. But I carried your voice in my mind, the way soldiers carry songs when they are too afraid to speak. If these words reach you, then the worst has happened. But not everything is lost, because I loved you, and I died with your name on my lips." The letter fell into her lap. Vivian bowed her head, the tears streaming down her cheeks like rain on glass. There was no need to silence them, no need to wipe them away. For once, grief was not a burden. It was a confirmation. It was proof that something sacred had existed, even if only in the quiet pages of a journal, buried beneath a forgotten shack in a land too far and too cruel. The door creaked behind her. She turned slowly. Etta stood there, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the weather, her skin almost translucent now, but her eyes clear, clearer than they had been in weeks. She moved slowly to Vivian's side, lowered herself to the floor beside the chaise, and took her sister's hand. "I always feared what was inside that box," Etta whispered, "and now I fear it even more, because I see what it's done to you." Vivian shook her head. "No," she said, "it hasn't broken me. It's freed me." Etta's voice trembled. "He waited too. We both did." Vivian turned to her sister, pressing their foreheads together. The past did not lift. It did not offer absolution, but in that moment, it no longer threatened to consume. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain fell in thin silver sheets across the garden, washing the dust from the leaves, darkening the earth and bathing the world in a hush that felt almost like reverence. Vivian rose, her hand still holding the letter. She placed it carefully into the cedar box beside the magnolia blossom and closed the lid. Then she stood at the window and whispered his name. Not to call him back, not to cling to what could never be, but to let it rest at last, in the place it had always belonged. In memory, in truth, in the heart of a woman who had loved not perfectly, but entirely, and that would remain. The clay estate stood as it always had, at the end of the long tree-lined road, draped in ivy and shadow. Its windows were shuttered tight against the world, its paint faded to a shade somewhere between regret and pride. Time had not ravaged it. No, time had simply withdrawn, leaving the house frozen in a state of elegant decay. The great columns still stood, proud but chipped, like a woman who once dazzled and now simply endured. Vivian had not returned here since the day Adeline Clay had offered her disdain like it were a calling card. But today she came with no trembling in her step. Her morning gown, though dark, was no longer funereal. Her gloves were soft grey, her hat was trimmed with a ribbon that caught the light, and her eyes, those eyes that had once pleaded, once searched, now saw with clarity, not hope. She ascended the steps without hesitation. The butler who opened the door was aged and stiff, a fixture of the house as much as the chandeliers and ancestral oil paintings. He blinked once, as though unsure whether to let her in, but Vivian needed no announcement. She passed through the grand entry like a woman returning to collect what was owed. Adeline was in the drawing room, seated in her high-backed chair beside the cold fireplace. She wore a gown of deep wine taffeta with a high collar and delicate lace cuffs. Her posture was, as ever, impeccable, but something had changed. The fire that once flared in her pale eyes had dulled. Her hands, once sharp with control, rested on the arms of the chair with a stillness that resembled defeat more than poise. "I see you've come to claim your answers," Adeline said without rising, her voice crisp, untouched by sentiment. "I've come to return what was taken from me," Vivian replied, stepping fully into the room, "and to tell you that I know." Adeline's eyes did not blink. "Then let's not pretend this will be a cordial visit." Vivian walked to the hearth, resting a gloved hand on the mantel as she surveyed the room. The portraits of long-dead Clays loomed from every wall, their faces captured in gilded frames that had dulled beneath dust and silence. This room had once commanded respect. Now it whispered of obsolescence. "Your brother survived," Vivian said. "He returned. He asked for me." Adeline's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "I found his letters, the ones you gave to Etta, and the one she could not bear to destroy." Vivian turned to face her fully. "He waited for me, until the very end." Adeline's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "And what would you have me say?" Vivian took a slow step forward. "The truth." A silence passed, long and heavy. Then Adeline stood. It was not the graceful movement of a woman in command, but the rise of someone who knew she would not win, but refused to surrender, seated. "I did what needed to be done," she said coldly. He was weak, wounded. His mind had changed, his allegiance had shifted. If he had returned, he would have shamed the family. Everything father built, all we preserved, our name would have meant nothing. "And what of love?" Vivian asked, her voice soft but piercing. "What of a man's right to return to the woman who waited for him? What of mine, to know he was alive?" Adeline's voice cracked, the first fracture in her composure. "You were not strong enough for what would have followed. You would have married him, yes, but you would have suffered. You would have been cast out of this town, forgotten. I spared you from ruin." Vivian's laughter came, quiet and bitter. "You didn't spare me. You silenced me. You erased the one thing in this life that was mine alone. I have lived for years carrying the weight of a love I believed had abandoned me, and now I know you were the one who abandoned him." Adeline stepped closer, her face pale with something that might have been shame, if shame could survive in a heart trained only in pride. "He wasn't the same," she whispered. "When I saw him, after the war, he was thinner. There was a darkness in him. He asked for you. I told him you were married." Vivian's breath caught. "You told him I had moved on?" "I lied," Adeline said, finally meeting her gaze, "because I knew that if he believed you had waited, he would never stop trying to find you. And I was tired, tired of pretending that the clay name meant something while he was out there, wandering tarnished. So I buried him, in silence, in stone. Vivian could not speak. The pain that bloomed in her chest was too great, too final. Adeline continued, quieter now. I am not sorry for protecting our name, but I am sorry that he never knew, that he died believing you had forgotten him. Vivian stepped back, her voice steady. I never forgot, and I never will. You protected a legacy no one remembers, but I carry a love that still breathes. The two women stood across from each other, once rivals in silence, now divided by truth. Vivian's eyes swept the room one final time. The velvet drapes, sun-faded. The piano, untouched. The relics of a world that had collapsed inward, slowly, proudly. You built a prison of tradition, Adeline, and you locked yourself in it. She turned then, walking out of the room, her steps echoing against the polished floor like a song ending. She did not look back. Behind her, Adeline remained still, a silhouette in a parlor full of ghosts, her lips parted but silent. The past, once so carefully preserved, had crumbled at her feet, and she, the architect of that quiet cruelty, had nothing left to defend. Outside, the sky had cleared. The wind moved through the trees with a hush of release. Vivian descended the steps without haste, breathing deeply. The air smelled of coming rain and magnolia, fresh, alive. She reached the gate and paused. She had not come to punish. She had not come to destroy. She had come to reclaim herself. And she had. With nothing more than truth and the grace of a woman who had loved without bitterness, lost without breaking, and stood at last not as a victim, but as the victor. The wind outside Hargrave House carried the scent of pine and something faintly metallic, like the hush before a winter rain. Savannah had turned pale in the light of early evening, the sky washed in lavender and silver, as if the season itself were softening, preparing to exhale. Inside, the house breathed in silence. Vivian sat at her writing desk, its surface cleared of all but a single sheet of thick cream paper, an inkwell, and the slender ivory-handled pen she had once used only for invitations. The desk faced the window, where she could see the bare magnolia tree, its branches now stripped of bloom, but still reaching skyward like fingers, unwilling to release the sky. She had watched those branches for hours. Now, she would speak. A fire crackled low in the hearth behind her. The rest of the house had surrendered to dusk, shadows pooling in corners like old memories, but she had lit no lamps. This was not a moment that required light. It required truth. Her hand hovered above the paper, and then she began. Thaddeus, I am not writing this so you might read it. I know now that the last place your eyes ever searched for me was behind a lie. That you asked, that you returned, that you carried me with you, and still died, believing I had let go. I didn't. Her pen moved without pause, her hand steady despite the tears that had long since dried on her skin. I waited for you. I wore your name beneath my breath for years. I wore black not for the man who shared my house, but for the one who carried my soul into silence. And when the world told me to forget, I did not. I folded your name into every quiet room I walked, into every letter I never sent, into every morning I rose alone. You were never forgotten. The words spilled from her, not with rage, but with release, grief woven with gratitude, sorrow heavy with love. You should have known that I would have walked through ruin for you. That shame would never have kept me from your side. But you were sent away from me not by fate, but by hands I trusted. I forgive them, not because they deserve it, but because I will not give them the power to poison what was beautiful between us. She paused, exhaled. I wish I could have held you one last time. I wish you had seen the years I carried you, but perhaps some part of you did. Perhaps that's why you never stopped writing. She looked down at the paper. Her hand trembled now, just slightly. I am writing this not for you, but for myself. Because for the first time I no longer wish to live inside an echo. I want to live again, not beyond you, not after you, but beside your memory, with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. You were my home, Thaddeus, and now I return to myself." She signed only her name, Vivian. She folded the letter with care, the way one folds a sacred thing, not to close it, but to protect it. Then she stood, her skirts whispering against the floor, and crossed the room. Near the fireplace, beneath the same old escritoire where she had first found his letter, the floorboard had already been loosened. She had pulled it free earlier, her fingers digging past the edges of wood and dust. Now she opened the small hollow once more and placed her letter inside, beside the faded ones he had written, beside the silence they had shared. She returned the board to its place, smoothed the seam with her palm, and rose slowly. A knock sounded at the door. She turned toward it, startled only by how gently the moment arrived. At the entrance, Jonah stood with his hat in one hand and a bundle of pale winter roses in the other. Their petals were cream with faint veins of blush, flowers that did not pretend to bloom brightly, but offered their softness without shame. "I found these outside the church," he said, voice quieter than the wind. "I thought they might belong here." She stepped aside to let him in. The house welcomed him now, not as a visitor, but as someone whose presence had become familiar. Not expected, but no longer strange. The firelight lit his features as he entered the parlor. His coat, damp from the mist, still held the scent of rain. He did not speak immediately. He looked around the room, at the polished desk, the sealed inkwell, the quiet certainty that something had ended. Vivian took the roses from his hand, their stems still cool. "They're beautiful." He smiled faintly. "They reminded me of her." She looked up. "Your wife?" He nodded. "She loved winter roses. Said they were like her, late to bloom but stubborn once they did." Vivian set the flowers gently in a glass vase and placed it on the mantel. "You loved her deeply," she said, not as a question, but as an understanding. "Yes," he replied, "and I carried that love with me for years after she passed. I thought perhaps that was all I'd ever do, carry it, quietly." Vivian turned to face him, the fire casting shifting light across his face. "And now?" she asked. He met her gaze with a steadiness that had nothing of conquest, only truth. "Now I wonder," he said softly, "if love can live beside what came before, if sorrow isn't something to silence, but something to share." Vivian stepped closer, not dramatically, not with trembling, but with a calm she had earned. "I wrote to him today," she said, "not to bring him back, not to hold on, just to let myself speak." He nodded. "Did it help?" She hesitated, then with a soft smile. "Yes, because it made room for something else. Something that might begin, not because I am empty, but because I am not." He said nothing, but his hand found hers. He did not grasp it. He simply rested his fingers atop hers, a touch so gentle it could have been mistaken for hesitation, except for the warmth that passed between them. They stood like that, side by side, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the magnolia branches outside. No vows were made, no confessions demanded. Only the silent understanding of two souls that had been broken quietly, slowly, and had endured. The letter beneath the floor remained undisturbed, but above it, in the room where grief had once ruled unchallenged, something else had bloomed. Not loudly, not in defiance, but like a winter rose, tender, pale, and impossibly alive. The air had changed. Not abruptly as storms do, but with the slow and reverent hush of a hymn. The morning sun filtered through the gauze of late March clouds, catching on the dew-laced petals of the magnolia tree just outside Hargrave House. The blooms had returned, ivory and blushing, full and fragile, and with them the world seemed to exhale. Etta Hargrave sat on the porch wrapped in a pale blue shawl that once belonged to their mother. Her hair, thinner now, caught the breeze in wisps that curled around her cheeks. Her eyes were softer than before, still shadowed by time, but no longer clouded by guilt. She watched the magnolias in silence. Beside her, a small tray rested on the table, a cup of chamomile tea half-sipped, a silver spoon unmoved, and atop her lap, a faded quilt stitched by hands long gone. Etta's fingers moved absent-mindedly over the patterns, as if trying to remember them by touch. "Do you think they remember?" she asked without turning. Vivian, who stood just inside the doorway adjusting the buttons of her lavender gloves, paused. The trees? The men? The ones who went and never came back? Vivian stepped out slowly. Her dress, a gown of soft grey trimmed with pale lace, moved gently with each step. She no longer wore black, not since the morning she had written that final letter and returned it to the silence beneath the floorboards. The mourning bonnet, once a symbol of her devotion and loss, now rested in the upstairs drawer, untouched for weeks. She sat beside her sister, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Etta's ear. "I think," she said gently, "they never truly leave the places that loved them." Etta exhaled, her breath catching faintly. "I like to think he knows." Vivian did not ask who. There was no need. The magnolia blossoms moved with the wind, like old souls bowing to memory. Later that afternoon, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel signaled the arrival of Jonah Bennett. He emerged from the coach with his usual grace, leaning slightly on his cane, his coat neatly pressed, a thin white scarf tucked beneath the collar. He wore no hat today, allowing his silver-threaded hair to catch the light. In one hand, he carried a small gift wrapped in ivory paper. Vivian met him at the door, her expression serene. "You're early," she said, amused. "I thought you might need someone to remind you that Savannah women are expected to be fashionably late, unless accompanied by someone with a limp," he replied with a glint in his eye. Vivian smiled. "Then let us be scandalous together." He offered his arm and she took it. The recital was held at the Whitmore residence, just beyond the oak-lined avenue. The music room had been transformed with sunlight and ribbons, and rows of chairs arranged in gentle arcs faced the grand piano. Jonah's granddaughter, Mary Elise, a girl of 16 with curls like spun gold, stood poised with a composure far beyond her years. Vivian watched from her seat beside Jonah as the room filled with neighbors and acquaintances, a few of whom cast sidelong glances her way, curious perhaps about the woman who had once withdrawn from the world and now sat, lips parted in quiet awe, eyes glistening as the first notes of Chopin floated into the air. The melody, soft and haunting, moved through the room like a whispered secret. Vivian's fingers rested on the back of Jonah's hand. He looked at her, not as a man pining, nor as one seeking anything more than this moment, but as someone who had also stood at the edge of grief and chosen, despite all odds, to keep living. After the final applause and embraces of congratulations, the guests began to rise, filtering toward the exit with laughter and the light murmur of gossip. Vivian remained seated a moment longer, her eyes drawn toward the tall window at the end of the room. There, in the soft glow of afternoon, stood a single empty chair, and resting on its cushion, forgotten or left with intention, was a pale bonnet edged with black lace. Vivian approached it slowly. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the fabric she had once worn like a second skin. Then, with the gentlest of gestures, she lifted it from the chair and walked toward the nearest windowsill. Outside, spring had arrived in full. With the grace of a benediction, she set the mourning bonnet down and stepped back. Her reflection in the glass no longer carried the weight of absence. It shimmered, instead with quiet resolve. Jonah joined her. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's walk." They declined the coach and chose the long way home. The gravel road curved beneath arched trees in bloom, their shadows dappled with sunlight. Vivian walked without gloves now, her hand occasionally brushing his. No promises were made, no need for declarations, just the rhythm of footsteps in unison, and the shared silence that had become a language between them. Hargrave House came into view as the sun began its descent. The porch glowed gold in the evening light. Inside, Etta had fallen asleep in her chair, the quilt still across her lap, the tea now cold. Vivian stepped into the parlor and paused. Something in the room had shifted, not in furniture nor in scent, but in feeling. The house no longer echoed like an empty tomb. It breathed again, softly, gently. She crossed to the corner where the desk stood. There, sunlight pierced through the sheer curtain, casting gold across the worn floorboards, and just at the edge of that light, the shadows caressed two edges of parchment, barely visible where the wood had once lifted. One bore the faded ink of a man, long gone. The other, the name of a woman learning to live again. Vivian looked down, a tear slipping quietly down her cheek, not from pain, but from grace. She pressed her palm to the floor, warm now beneath the setting sun, and whispered to no one in particular, "He never came back." And yet somehow love found its way to me all the same. Outside, the magnolias bloomed, and inside Hargrave House, a second spring had begun. Savannah, 1880. The city had changed, but not entirely. The moss still clung to the oaks like threads of memory, and the magnolia trees still bloomed with their silent grandeur every spring. The war had ended long ago, but its echo still lingered in the bones of buildings and in the spaces between heartbeats. On the edge of the city, Hargrave House still stood. Its porch had been repainted a soft ivory. The roof had been mended, the garden replanted. Roses now framed the walkway, and a cherry tree, Jonah's gift on their second anniversary, had grown tall enough to cast shade in the afternoons. Inside, sunlight spilled through the lace curtains Vivian had sewn by hand. The scent of lavender and old books danced in the air. Vivian Bennett, once Hargrave, stood in the front parlor, her hair now streaked with silver, but still pinned in the elegant style she preferred. She wore a dress of dusky plum, with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons and a brooch at her throat. Her hands bore the marks of time, but her eyes had not dimmed. They held the same quiet fire, the same clarity. She looked out the window toward the garden where Jonah knelt beside their youngest grandchild, helping the boy plant seeds in the spring soil. His limp had worsened with the years, but he still moved with intention, deliberate, strong. His hair had turned white, his voice deeper, but he still brought Vivian winter roses each January, wrapped in newspaper, just as he had that first time. They had never had children of their own. Vivian had married Jonah too late for such hopes, but his family had embraced her as one of theirs. Mary Elise had grown into a poised young woman, married to a kind schoolteacher and now mother of 3. The grandchildren called Vivian Gran Vive, a name that made her heart swell each time she heard it. She had not expected such joy to come from a second spring, but it had, and more. Etta had passed 5 years prior. She had gone peacefully, with Vivian holding her hand and reading aloud one of Thaddeus's letters, the one with the magnolia blossom still pressed inside. Etta had wept, not from regret, but from relief. "You made something beautiful of your life," she had whispered. He would have wanted that. Adeline Clay, once regal and cruel, had died 2 years later, alone in the house that no longer bore the weight of its name. No one claimed her belongings. The estate had been sold quietly, and the Clay family cemetery left to the wilds. No monument was erected. Only the weathered stone bearing Thaddeus Clay's name remained, no body beneath it still, only memory. But that memory lived elsewhere now. Vivian stepped into the study. The floorboards no longer creaked the way they had, but she still knew the exact one, the 4th from the hearth, where her letter to Thaddeus still rested. She had never removed it. Some part of her could not. It belonged there, like a heartbeat, in the foundation of the life she had built. The room had become a library of sorts. Bookshelves lined the walls, letters framed beneath glass. One of Jonah's war journals had been published, with a dedication to VH. It who reminded me that truth has a voice worth remembering. On the mantel above the fireplace sat two photographs. One, a daguerreotype of Jonah and Vivian on their wedding day, his hand gently over hers. The second, older, a faded portrait of Thaddeus Clay in uniform, eyes full of youth and promise. She looked at them both, the man who had first taught her love, and the man who had taught her how to love again. Outside, children's laughter rose from the garden. Jonah turned his head toward the window and smiled at her, broadly, fully. She returned the smile and made her way to the porch, sitting beside him on the swing they had hung together their first summer as husband and wife. Time had not been gentle, but it had been generous. Vivian leaned her head against Jonah's shoulder as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting golden light across the house they had saved, not just with wood and paint, but with forgiveness, tenderness, and the courage to begin again. And as the magnolias swayed above them, full and fragrant, she closed her eyes and whispered softly, "Love found its way to me and stayed." In a world that often rushes past the stories of those who loved quietly, who waited with dignity, who lost and still chose to hope, Vivian's journey reminds us of something timeless, that it's never too late, not to forgive, not to begin again, and certainly not to love. Her story, woven with silence, loss, and resilience, teaches us that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in the form of a letter never sent, a hand reached out after years of solitude, a second spring that blooms long after winter thought it had the final word. If this tale touched your heart in any way, tell us in the comments. What moved you the most? What did Vivian's journey awaken in you? And if you made it all the way here, write the word magnolia in the comments. That way, we'll know you stayed with us until the very last petal fell. If you'd like to support the small team behind these stories, you can send a super thanks in the amount that feels right for you. Every little gesture helps us bring more of these heartfelt journeys to life. And if a financial thank you isn't possible right now, sharing this story with a friend is a beautiful gift in itself. We've left more unforgettable stories waiting for you in the video cards at the end. Stories of second chances, of impossible love, of women who dared to feel deeply even when the world told them not to. Thank you, truly, for walking this path with Vivian. Now, what will you do with your second spring?